Hey everyone, in today's video, I want to introduce you to HTMX. So HTMX is a tool that you can use to replace JavaScript in many situations. And the basic idea is it allows you to perform requests based off of triggers that happen in your code without writing any JavaScript. So typically you would know you need JavaScript for something like this. Like if you want to respond to user action, you need some kind of JavaScript. And of course, technically there is JavaScript, but the library itself is more of like an extension to HTML. So when you write HTMX code, you're not writing any JavaScript at all. You're basically writing as if HTML has extra features. And it takes the idea of submitting forms in HTML and performing requests like through links and everything, and it extends it so you can do this basically anytime you want. So the two examples that I'm going to demonstrate in this video are how to create this dynamic dropdown. So here, if I go to Ruby, I can see the frameworks associated with Ruby that I put. If I go to JavaScript, I can see Express, and Python, I have some frameworks here. And then I also have this search, which will allow me to search for food. So I have this API that searches for foods and gives you some information. I just want to return the name of the food. So if I put something like rice and wait a second because there is a small delay, then I see I have all these things that have rice in the name. And of course I can do something else like Pepsi, and I should see results that have Pepsi in the name as well, like this soft drink, cola, etc. And really the basic idea behind HTMX is it's all HTML. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be writing some attributes in the HTML, and then I'm going to be returning some additional HTML from my server, which is a basic Flask app, and it's going to be injected into the HTML by HTMX. So of course, like always, the example will kind of show you what I mean. And this is just an introduction video, so I won't make it too complicated. I'll just show you what needs to be done. But you'll see how simple it is, and I suggest that you try this out on your own and see if you can use it in any of your projects, because it can save a lot of time and reduce a lot of complexity if you're writing fairly basic HTML. Like if you need something really complicated, you still might need a framework like React or Vue. But if you're doing something simple, then HTMX might work for you. So let's get into the examples. Let's begin by working on the dropdown. So here's the code that I have. It's pretty short, and this route handles displaying the page with the dropdown. So I'm rendering this template dropdown.html, and this is what it looks like. Basically, I just have two selects here. One has the values Python, Ruby, and JavaScript, and the other has an empty select, which will be populated by HTMX. If we go here to app, I also have this dictionary called languages frameworks. And basically it just has some frameworks associated with each language. So Python has Django, Flask, and Fast API. And you see the ones for Ruby and JavaScript. So these values in the list here will be populated in the second dropdown. And of course, it depends on the value of the first dropdown. That's why I have it here. Normally, this would come from a database, but in this particular example, I don't think that's necessary. So I just have this dictionary here in the code. And to take a look at it, we see I have my select here, my drop down here with the three options, and then the other one has nothing. So the idea is when I change this, I want to load in the values here. So the way that HTMX works is first you have to think about how you want it to respond to some user actions. So the user action in my case is selecting some item, right? So that's one thing you need to know. The other thing that HTMX needs to know is what is going to be replacing something else. So if you think about it, I have the select and there's nothing inside. So what I want to do is I want to generate some HTML and I want to put it inside of the select. So to do that, I need to have some HTML that I want to have injected, and I need to get that from a certain place. So that's where the endpoint comes in. So you can use something like hxget, hxpost, and just looking at this example here, we have this button, we have this hxpost here. This is the endpoint that is going to perform a request to, and the response should be some HTML that it's going to do something with. So let me show you what that looks like. So if I go here to dropdown, like I said, this is basically like an extension to HTML. So the idea here is that I want to modify the select so that something happens every time the user changes the value. So every time the user changes the value, something's going to happen. So I can start with that. And to handle changing, it's called HX trigger. So HX trigger here. And in here, I specify the events. So the events are the same as the regular JavaScript events. So I want change, right? And if I think about this a little more, in addition to change, I also want this to work on load. So by default, Python is selected first. So I want this to work on load as well. So the second dropdown will be populated like we saw at the beginning of the video. So once I have that, I need to specify the place to get the HTML that's going to be put inside of this select here. So to do that, you use HX and then the HTTP method that you're interested in. In my case, I want get, but this can be like post or delete or put or whatever. But I just want get here. So now inside of get, what I want to do is I want to specify the endpoint. So I'm going to create a new endpoint in a moment, and I'm going to call this /frameworks, right? So it's going to be past the language, and I'm going to get a list of frameworks in return. And then the last thing I need to do is I need to specify where this HTML is going to go. So I'm going to get some HTML from this frameworks route, and I want to put it somewhere. Well, I want to put it inside of the select. So if I do HX target, then I can specify the location that the HTML should go. So if I call this frameworks here, because the ID is that, and then I need the hash for the ID, it's going to take the HTML that's returned from this endpoint frameworks and put it inside of the select. Now, I could replace the select entirely, but by default, it just puts it inside. So there are different ways you could replace the HTML, and you have HX swap for that. But in this video, I won't cover that. I'm just going to put things inside of the element, so inside of select here. So now that I have that, I do need to bring in the JavaScript for this, so just to load it. So what I'll do is I'll just copy the CDN link and I'll just put it down here. And this is just getting the code for HTMX, but everything else is basically an extension of HTML. So now that I have that, I can go over to my app and I'm going to create the endpoint for returning the HTML for the frameworks. So remember, I call this frameworks, and I'll just call this frameworks as a function as well. And the first thing I want to do is I want to get the language that the user selected. So if I look here, we see name here. So it's going to pass the value of the option that's selected with a request. So just like if you have a form, it passes the value through the form data. Here, it's going to pass in the value of the options through this name language. So I can get that by using requests. So let me import it here at the top. And then I can do requests.args.get language. So that will give me the option that's selected. And I can just call this language here as a variable. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to get the frameworks from here. So I have a variable called, let's say, list of frameworks. And it's going to be the data store. And it's going to be this languages frameworks dictionary. And I'm just passing you the language. So this will return the list associated with the language that was selected. Finally, what I want to do is I want to return this to a template. So the template is HTML, and that's what I want to generate. So in a moment, I'll create the actual template, but for now, I can just return. And I'll call this framework options.html. And I need to pass in the list of frameworks that I retrieve from the data store here. So now let me go ahead and create a new template, and we'll call this framework options, just like I did here. And this will be pretty simple. So if I look back here, I'm filling in this particular select with some options, right? So options just look like this. And I have a list of them so I can loop. So I'm basically just creating a list of options like that. So if I go to the template again and do a for loop. So for framework in list of frameworks. And then I can close this here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to generate these option tags. So option value equals something. And then inside we have the actual display value of the option. So in this case, I want them to be the same. So framework with the 2 curly brackets, and then I can do the same thing for the value. So I just put that there, and that should be everything that we need. So just to say this again here. Every time the page is loaded, so I have the trigger for load or the select is changed, then it will trigger this get here to frameworks. And then frameworks returns some HTML, and then it's going to put that HTML in the target here, frameworks, which is this select. So let's go ahead and see if it works. So here we see the page is loaded and it already has some Python frameworks. I can change this to Ruby and we see it's Rails, Sinatra, and JavaScript. That should be expressed with an R and happy. Let me just go ahead and change that to an R. And I'll also remove the load so we can see what happens if I take away that trigger. So I load this now and we see nothing is there because the load trigger is no longer there. Now if I put on Ruby, now it changes. JavaScript Express has the R in it. And now if I go to Python, it works. So typically for something like this, you want it to load first and it will go ahead and perform the request for you. And just to take a look at the network tab, I'll refresh again and we see here we have this call to frameworks with the language Python. And then we see the response is just some options. This is HTML. So we see the 3 options here that were generated. And that's basically the way that it works. So you have to think of the trigger that will cause this request to happen. You need to think about the location that the request will be sent to. And then you need to think about what you're going to do with the response HTML. The response is always going to be HTML. So you just think about where you're going to put it and how you're going to change the place where you put it. In this case, we're just putting it inside the middle of the select. But in other cases, you can put it like at the beginning, you can put it at the end, you can replace the entire element. There are many different ways you can do this. It's basically HX swap for that. So just take a look at the documentation and you can see the different places. So like inner HTML, outer HTML, before begin, and so on. So now let's go to the second example. So the second example is search. And I'll just leave this open. So what I want to be able to do here is just type in a name of a food like pizza, and it will automatically load the results. So let's think about the trigger here. The trigger is whenever this text changes, right? I don't have a button, so I just want this to work when the text changes. And when you're dealing with an input like this, change as a event doesn't work very well because I want it to happen as they're typing. So there's actually the key up event that I really want to do. So I'm going to have this fire on the key up event, meaning I just typed a letter and I want it to perform the request. And because everyone types at different speeds, I'll put a delay on it so it's not going to fire right away. So it'll give people more time to finish typing. So you'll see that in a moment. And then I'm going to send this request to an endpoint that will query the API for me and then get the results and return some HTML as a list of things that can be displayed underneath this text input. And the final thing is I need to put that somewhere, which is basically going to be a div, and it's going to put the results directly inside of the div. So let's go over here and let's close out the drop down in the framework options. And now let's look at the search. So same thing, I have a template for search here. And there's basically the HTML for this. So we have the foods, we have the input, and then we have this results here where the actual results are going to go. Let's bring in the link for the code here and just put it at the bottom. And that should have opening tag like that. Okay. So like I said, what I want to do is I want to have something happen on key up for the input. So I can start putting the other attributes here for HTMX. So the first attribute is going to be the trigger, HX trigger. And like I said, key up is the one that I want, right? And also I can have a modifier called changed, right? So if there's a key up, but it still has the same value as before, nothing happens. So I want the combination of key up and change. So this is different from the change event. The change event is like a built-in HTML event. Changed, on the other hand, is more for HTMX. So it's basically comparing the previous value to the current one, and it's seeing if there's a difference. So if I have a key up and something has changed, then I want to have the trigger. And like I said, I want to have a delay. So a delay is pretty easy to add. You just put the word delay, a colon, and then the length of the delay. Let's say 500 milliseconds. You can do a second, anything you want, but I'll just put 500 milliseconds. Now, the next thing I need to do is I need to specify the location for this. So I'm going to create an endpoint. Let's say HX get, and then I'll have this as search foods, right? And then I need a place for this to go. So HX targets, and this is going to be results, right? So that's all that I need on this end. Now I need to work on the endpoint to return those results. And here I have search, and we'll have get search foods. So search underscore foods. And this is going to return some HTML at the end. So let's just return render template foods.html. So we'll see this in a moment. And I'm going to have basically a list of things. So foods equals foods. So this is what I'm building towards when I'm doing this. And inside of the route here, what I want to do is I first want to get the query. So the name on the input here is Q. So I'll just get this. So request.args.get Q. And then because it can be empty depending on what the user is doing, like if they delete it, I want to check if Q has a value. And actually, if it doesn't have a value, I'm going to return nothing. So I can return an empty string, and that's interpreted as HTML, which means like nothing gets inserted into the results. So the next thing I need to do is I need to use my API to get the result. I don't want to type out the URL because it's pretty long, so I'll just copy it here. And just so you know what's going on, I'm just getting the result from the API with the query Q, right? So I'm passing it to the URL. And then also I'm passing in my API key, which is in my environment, right? So that should be enough for that. And then when it returns, I'm going to get a JSON object, and inside that JSON object will be a key called foods, which will be a list of all the foods that I'm interested in and some of the information associated with that food. So I'll say foods equals r.json. So I'm converting the response to JSON, and then I'm getting the key foods, which is a list of the different foods. And then I can pass this to the template foods.html. So let me go ahead and create that template. So foods.html. And what I want to do is I basically want to create like panels in Bulma. So this is just for visual purposes. So I'll have the for food and foods here. And I'll put the in for. Now inside of the loop, I need a link, which will be class of panel block, just like that. And then inside of here, this is where I can add the food description. So food.description, right? So now that I have that, the foods will be passed here. I'll get the description, which is just the name of the food, and it should display. So let's go ahead and try this now. I'll refresh the page and I'll search for pizza. And the API is a bit slow, but now we see pizza here. And for some reason, like the first 15 or so results are always the item capitalized. But then once you go down, you see like actual food items like Pizza Hut stuff, breakfast pizza, school lunch pizza, and so on. So if I change this to something else, let's say like a hamburger, and do the search again, just have to wait for the API. We see hamburger, stuff from McDonald's, Burger King, and so on. So just like before with the other one, all we had to do was just put some extra attributes on the relevant elements in our HTML. So it's like an extension of HTML. And then we had to create an endpoint that returns HTML. So unlike other APIs and things where you return JSON, you always need to return HTML because the whole point is like you're extending HTML when you do this. And that's all it takes. So you can have this be much more complicated if you want, but that's the basic idea. You just need to specify the trigger for something. Then you need to specify the endpoint where it's going to get the HTML, and you need to specify where you're going to put that HTML once you have it. So that's it for this video. Those are the two examples that I want to show you. I suggest that you check this out if you're not really interested in writing JavaScript all the time, or you need to do something that's pretty simple. Maybe this will work for you. So if you have any questions about this video, feel free to leave a comment down below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please subscribe. So thank you for watching, and I will talk to you next time.